So I'm going to talk about information operation campaigns on social media that are designed to disseminate false leaks. And we're going to look at a couple examples from the past 2 years. This is a snapshot of a broader research endeavor on our end, so I'm quite excited to be sharing some of it with you, but I'm also quite nervous and intimidated about that. So there are 3 phases in these false leaks, and I think it's important to separate them and consider how they work with one another. The first one, so this is when a threat actor is going to compromise its target and obtain the data that will later be presented as leaks. It's important that we use the term false leaks, because here we mean false in at least 2 senses. The first sense is it's false because it's not what is traditionally considered a leak, as in intentionally disseminated material. This is material that's being stolen. So the examples we're going to go through are going to be doping leaks, DNC leaks, and Macron leaks. So it's not an intentional disclosure, it's stolen material, and it's false in that sense. The other sense in which it can be false is the leak itself, the material that's going to be disseminated, can be falsified. So it can include fake emails, for instance, in the data that's going to be disseminated. Citizen Lab has coined a term that I like a lot to talk about, that it's tainted leaks. The idea is you have a forest of truth, but then elements of falsehoods that are included in the set that's going to be disseminated. So that's the hacking phase. The second part is the publication phase, and this goes to how the information is going to be made accessible to the public. And this can actually have different flavors and different types of actors involved who may or may not be linked to the original threat actors that conducted the hacking. So if you look at DC Leaks, for instance, it's hosted on its own website. It's published on its dedicated website. You can also publish the material by giving it to websites that specialize in this. So of course here WikiLeaks come to mind. And in the case of Macron leaks, there's also a possibility in which the file is simply dumped somewhere, for instance, on a forum or on the social media. And so the different actors involved in the publication phase are not necessarily linked to the first hacking phase. Now on to the third phase, which is dissemination, how information gets promoted and disseminated, and this is where we're going to be most focused on today. And so when you consider the end goal of the dissemination phase, it's really to hand off, to really pass the baton to a more organic conversation, is to initiate artificially something that's going to end up being an organic political debate. And this is what gets complicated and fascinating about false leaks, because often the material is legitimately interesting, and so a conversation that starts as being inorganic and manufactured ends up being a true political, legitimate conversation online. And so if we look at information operations assets that are known to have disseminated false leaks, what comes to mind is the Internet Research Agency. So here, what you're seeing is all the hashtags that have been disseminated by the IRA on Twitter, and they're organized by volume on one end and burst on the other. And so on the top left corner, you have things that they have talked about all the time, but with great consistency. They're sort of like woven into all the messages that they have targeted at the English-speaking audiences. So news, local, right after that, actually in the set, you can't see it here, but comes sports. So this is kind of like the blueprint of how you go and influence America, you know, news, local, sports. I was almost expecting to see like burger out there. And on the other side, you have operations. So super high volume, but really in one quick burst. Colombian Chemicals, who might be familiar to some of you, right? This first operation that they tested in 2015, things that they really pushed, but in one go. And highlighted in the sets, you see hashtags that are related to false leaks. And here, you see that they're actually quite frequent. Some of them have been pushed a little bit more as an operation. The second thing that appears here is that not particularly high in volume. One of the key explanations for that is the IRA was not the only operation and actor to be part of the dissemination phase of these leaks. And we know thanks to the technology, thanks to the Department of Justice indictments, that the institutions such as the GRU also had dedicated social media accounts that they were directly controlling, which primary purpose was the dissemination of these false leaks. There are two things that are important on these accounts. We see their public traces, but there's something else that we don't necessarily see, which is the actions that they may have taken not in their public traces. And we know that, for instance, they went and they actively reached out to commentators and to media for them to be part of the dissemination campaigns of these leaks, saying, hey, go and cover this material, this is coming, this is going to be of interest to you. Great. So from a network perspective, this creates an interesting challenge, which is how do you contrast and disambiguate organic, grassroots, spontaneous social media movements from manufactured, coordinated ones. Fake stuff from real stuff. This is something that we at Graphika, and along with a few of our academic partners, have been working on for a little while. And the idea is we're systematically contrasting legitimate and genuine political movements such as a protest with organized response, such as a counter movement that, for instance, would have been coordinated and conducted by a troll farm. Now, the core hypothesis that is at the heart of this work is that when you have a small number of accounts, and they're going to seek to replicate the diversity of a big number of accounts, they're going to fail to do so on at least some of the dimensions. So they may manage to make believe, but if you look at enough network dimensions, you will see network anomalies that will reveal the coordination and the fabrication of the movement. And so we systematically study those alongside three dimensions and the way they intersect. So the network dimension, how are the accounts who participate connected to one another? The semantic dimension, what is the nature of their language patterns? And the temporal dimension, how does the campaign move in there? It's easier, of course, to see this at the campaign level than it is to see this at the network level. The other thing that we look for when we look at false leaks is how much the original actors have blended or disappeared from the dissemination pattern. So the controlled assets, are they still in the middle of the conversation? Or have they successfully passed the batons? And the target communities, right, the communities you want to influence, are they still in the middle of the conversation? Or have they sort of been marginalized? So this was very abstract. Like, look at how this looks in concrete on a network map with a first case study, which is doping leaks. That's a timeline that recaps the first two phases from hacking and publication. Here, publication is done on a dedicated website, fancybear.net. And this is the network map of accounts who participate in the dissemination. So there's a few things that are interesting in that network map. First, I can give you a little bit more context on how we do that. This is on Twitter. This is a social media site on the Twitter front. These are the accounts who shared the hashtag doping leaks or who shared the link to the publication website that was hosting the documents. They are here. We do this with both a discovery process, so we make sure we grab the part of the network that's the more relevant and the tightest connected, and then by a rationalization and clustering process. The clustering here is done on mutual followership. And so accounts that are grouped together and of the same color are together because they highly follow one another, which tends to reveal interest-based communities. So if you take one of them, for instance, the German right wing, they're called German right wing because they are communicating in German and they share right wing websites and they talk about German right wing topics, right? So they appear together as a coherent community. From the network pattern, which you can see, remember that network map? There was something in the middle. It was purple, and it was right in the middle of the map. And it was weird because it was a spam cluster. It was called SMM, Social Media Marketing and Spam. And I tell you something, I look at a lot of network maps, spam clusters are not supposed to be in the middle of the map. This means that they have used a lot of spammy accounts. These are for-hire accounts. These are accounts who yesterday was promoting Viagra and today are promoting doping leaks. And it's not today, we're 2 years ago. But this is the first thing that's shocking about this network map, is there's still a bulk of the network that is spam. Remember things around spam. They were also weird. They were European far-right communities. And the thing that we're actually looking for, the sports cluster, right? The people who should be carrying the waters on this conversation, they're so peripheral to the conversation. The people that you seek to influence there are really a very small portion of that network map. They're only about 4.4% of the entire map. And the other thing that's interesting is when you look for the media accounts, right? Who are the media who are talking about this famous doping leaks that all the spam bots are interested in? They're not in that map. Actually, the only media of significance is Sputnik in that map. Now, remember the IRA and the GRU assets, right? Those that we know that have been attributed, we're able to see where they were in the dissemination. And so this is the 73 IRA accounts who heavily participated in promoting, disseminating doping leaks, along with 3 GRU accounts, and they're still very central in the network that is disseminating these false leaks, right? They have not succeeded in passing the baton. They're still front and center, organizing the party of people who are disseminating this leaks. This is really the IRA set that is a bit understudied these days because it's the Russian-speaking IRA set. They're in the Russian pro-government cluster. So those would not be sort of the famous IRA profiles that you know of. Those are also in the map on the other side in the pro-Trump US right clusters. And then you have a lot of other spare IRA assets and GRU assets, some in the WikiLeaks groups, and then some in the pro-Assad clusters who have decided that suddenly they cared a lot about doping in sports. Of course, this shows in the network anomalies, right? Because you have this very active, somewhat unsuccessful attempt to masquerade as a spontaneous campaign. But when you look at network anomalies, you see that this doesn't really fit. So the expected pattern on the temporal analysis, here what we're showing is these small squares show clusters who participate in the campaign at the same time. And the expected pattern is a low temporal coordination between those clusters. Some of it is expected, a lot of it is odd. The thing that's particularly odd here is extremely high level of temporal coordination across clusters that are completely different in interest, that are not connected to one another, and that are on completely different time zones. The other thing that's odd is if you do semantic analysis here, we're looking at each user in the map, and we're trying to find their semantic diversity score. And so this is a fun range because humans generally fall in the middle. Here you have single topic accounts, so accounts who only talk about one thing. It's actually quite rare. People tend to have semantic diversity even when they have a very committed topic. So this is oddity. On the other side is the other abnormal behavior, completely random topics. This is generally characteristic of spam just because they tend to grab everything that is peaking. And so the human range is generally the middle. What you would expect is to find most of your participants in the human range. Here, as you can see, we have a huge proportion of single topic accounts, which is also a network oddity. All that to say, when we look at doping leaks, it's very clear that the disseminating accounts are still very visible and that the campaign still bears the markers of something that's very manufactured and coordinated. Now let's look at the US example with a few false leaks targeting the 2016 presidential election. Here it's a bit complex and interesting and different because you have a few actors involved in the 3 different stages, from the hacking to the publication to the dissemination. And we're going to take DC leaks as sort of an overarching factor, as in DC leaks, the publication websites on which some of these materials have been disseminated. What's interesting is there's also dissemination on WikiLeaks as a separate, publication on WikiLeaks as a separate publication website. And the way the false leaks are disseminated is also different from the way they're both obtained initially and published. And so what we're going to find is different dissemination campaigns that are going to come and push different subset of the false leaks. The first one we can look at is DC leaks. And so DC leaks here is users most actively sharing that dcleaks.com website and the DC leaks hashtag. So that's a map that I like quite a lot because it makes a point very clearly, which is that most of the dissemination here is obviously happening on the back of a hyper-polarized network. You see those 2 big clusters, the Bernie support cluster and the Trump support cluster. We call them cores. They're very tightly interconnected accounts. They have little connection to one another, but there is one central group that acts as a network bridge, is the pro-Russian conspiracy network group. So they're not connected to each other, but they're both connected to this Russian, pro-Russian conspiracy group that really acts as a network bridge between the 2. And so that's the first thing. This is a dissemination that operates on the back of a deeply fractured and polarized and hyperactive network. So it's not only 2 sites that don't talk to one another, it's 2 super structured, very well clustered sites that don't talk to one another. The other thing that's interesting is when you look at media nodes, remember there was almost none in doping leaks. Here we jump to almost 34% of the map is clustered in media. So we saw in that initial IRA graph with the hashtags that the IRA accounts did heavily participate in promoting, disseminating DC leaks. The map that I just showed you was constructed after those accounts have been taken down. So what we did is a reconstruction of where those IRA accounts were woven into the fabric of the initial network that I just showed you that was disseminating the DC leaks. So this answers the question, when you look at this network, how much of it had been penetrated and influenced by accounts that we now know are associated with IRA and GRU. And this is the yellow nodes that you see on the back. So those are the active, at that stage, now all inactive and attributed IRA accounts. And the thing that appears very clearly here is you see how well woven into the fabric that they were trying to influence those accounts were. They're not woven uniformly throughout the landscape. So here they're very central to the Trump group. And you see them both in their position in the network and the size of the nodes. The size of the nodes here is going to reveal how much of the group around them is following them. So this is not just a measure of influence in abstracto, it's influence in that network. So they're very influential to that own network. They're densely connected across the middle, as you can see. They're somewhat influential through progressive independent media clusters, but they're entirely absent from the Bernie group. That's interesting because I know in my field, a lot of people suspect that that group specifically had also been very affected and targeted by information operations. If that is the case, it wasn't by the IRA or not by those known assets, because they do not reach into that group. Of course, you see how much of their potential activity sort of helped really carry the water and then pass the baton to the polarized landscape. So if we change the dissemination focus, we can look at Podesta leaks. this was somewhat disseminated differently. You can think about it as almost marketed differently, marketed to a different group. The resulting network maps show a focus that's much more on the right-wing side of the landscape. This is a dissemination that really lands on the political right-wing part of the landscape. And so what's interesting here is when you wonder, okay, why, and you look back at the known assets activity, you see that this is really by design, and that they go and they mention and engage the part of the network that they want to further engage around the dissemination. The top most mentioned account with the Podesta leaks is still going to be Hillary Clinton, but here you see that there are about 3 times as many right-affiliated accounts that were mentioned than accounts on the left, which may contribute to explain why this really lands on that part of the political spectrum. Now, similar publication point. So DCLeaks.com, oh sorry, that's a chronotope. So this shows each group when they engage with the hashtag. The thing that's quite fun here, because there is fun in network graphs, I promise, is you see this regular rate. That's not normal. This is a very pulsating slow beat, which means that all the clusters are going to engage with the same hashtag at the same time and at a regular pattern. So this still betrays marks of coordination across the network. Soros leaks now. Interesting, same publication point, also ends up on DC Leaks. Disseminated differently, so by different accounts and with a different focus. This brings in an entire different set of clusters, international clusters this time. Still, you see the pro-Russia group here that acts as a network bridge alongside different communities of mostly right and far-right groups in Europe who have little connection to one another, but who are still connected to this core cluster. There is also very few footprints of IRA and GRU known assets in some of these networks. Although looking at it, for instance, in the Netherlands, what we do see is operations that were later revealed by actors, notably Facebook, as to be part of Russian operations too. I'm thinking the Inside Syria Media Center do appear to be very popular in some of these clusters. So back to this idea that maybe we're not in control of the full picture of the known assets, and some of them remain a little bit unexplained. So same thing, chronotope. Here this tells you this entire network is really engaged. It's not like the French cluster sort of dropped in, pushed it a little bit, and dropped out. They remain engaged throughout the entire dissemination phase. Macron leaks. I'm allowed to say Macron with a French accent, is that French? Macron leaks timeline. Similarly, different story on the publication front. Somewhat potentially comparable story on the hacking front with other elements we've seen before, but on the publication front, we have a file that is dumped on a forum, and the dissemination story is also quite interesting. So this is high citers only, which means that this looks at the accounts who are really committed to pushing the story out, who talked about it 5 times or more and shared the links. You still see the central pro-Russian cluster. It's written out there in white, but it's really the white dots in the middle. The thing that's most surprising, and I think that surprised most of the people who initially looked at it, is in the early phase of the dissemination, the activity really comes from the US. And so that Trump group, US Trump support group in green, accounts for 53% of the activity in the first phase of the dissemination of those leaks. It is also a US account who first posts the publication website. The other thing is we do have 2 IRA assets that are in this map. They're both in the US groups. And here we have very little media clusters. So about 7% of the nodes are media clusters. Only 4% is French media. The campaign does display signs of being heavily coordinated. This one's interesting because the anomaly is on the other side, not a lot of one-topic accounts like we saw in Doping Leaks, but a lot of completely random accounts that suggest more automation, more bot-like, which is supported by other metrics that we've computed on that front. Temporal dimension, same thing. The anomaly is in clusters who are in completely different time zones, who have completely different interests, who are not connected to one another, but who really engage exactly at the same time on this campaign. So to wrap this up between all these different maps, something else that's quite interesting is when we run node overlaps between all these maps, we find a lot of accounts that are in common in those dissemination campaigns, even for false leaks that have little to do in substance with one another. So we added Vault 7 and Scope here just because it's both in the IRA dissemination set and because of the very high number of overlaps with the other false leaks campaigns that we have seen in that set. So I see you're done soon, so I'm going to wrap up quickly. Final thoughts. Embedded assets. If you want to do information operations and disseminate false leaks, you really need to have accounts that are woven into the fabric of the conversation that you're trying to influence. You can't just spin up a few accounts and then have them push something, maybe hashtag or site. You really need to do this work of having accounts that are well followed and well embedded in the communities that you're targeting. Now, the good news and the flip side of this is that means that detection and takedown matter. This morning, I co-published a piece with DFR Lab on a French campaign that had been detected and taken down by Facebook, who was still in this audience building stage. So you can see them trying to gather the community around them, try and engage the community they're seeking to target by talking about completely inane things and having hashtags like, follow me, I'll follow you back. And this sort of like early stage of audience building is really key to having assets that are later exploitable, and it's really important to be able to go detect and take down at that stage. The second interesting thing through this leaks is the role of media clusters. So we saw from almost none to Doping Leaks to really heavy involvement in the US cases to back to almost none in the French case, which comes with a lot of heavy context because in France, at least two things really shaped that map. The first one is social media platforms at that stage had already learned from the tradecraft that we saw in both Doping Leaks and DNC. So a lot of accounts had been detected and deactivated, including potential accounts who may have been pitching to media. That's one way in which media might not have been involved. And the other obvious one is in France, we had a legal framework in place that prevented media from touching and covering those Macron leaks. It was taken very seriously. It's in place 48 hours before the election, and the media actually received letters from the government reminding them of that obligation. Lastly, attributed accounts. Doing this research, doing this investigation isn't possible if we don't have enough attributed accounts to understand where that's coming from. It's difficult. We don't have so much. We have the IRA ones, we have tidbits of GRU ones. We found it really helpful to work from this set, and so caring is sharing. What we did, along with our partners at the German Marshall Fund, is we try to create a little archive that makes these data sets, notably the Russian IRA one and the Iranian one, soon the Reddit one, and really as much as we can find, and we're going to be able to organize and explain the attribution behind it. We try to make them searchable for others who want to do this work. So that's a prototype. If it's helpful for your purposes, feel free to play with it. If you are sitting on a bunch of social media attributed data and you want to share it with the research community, please send us an email. Voila. Thank you. Sorry about the slide.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm Jason Arterburn from C4ADS. I'm curious to know on the front end of your research how you determine which hashtags become like the bucket of your study. I don't know if they're obvious in every case, which ones you'll pick to scrape accounts or whatever. particularly with research looking to other jurisdictions like China or Taiwan, where there have been alleged influence operations as well. I'm curious what your process might be.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the case of false leaks, it's sort of the most obvious one because we don't only do hashtags, we also operate by scoping around URLs that are disseminated, right? So in the case of false leaks, you know that you're trying to call attention to a set. Either there's a very clear hashtag or there's a URL that you can scope around, so it takes care of that. When we do information operations work, we work with a network of partners, investigators, scholars, companies who each sort of like go after their own thing. When we do our own, we tend to, work on intuition and or information. Something like, to add a personal note to that, something that I've personally found very helpful is we have a part of our program that does work with civil society and civil society actors that are targeted by information operations. A lot of that work also ends up being quite important and helpful to understand potential state-sponsored accounts that later, shift to other operations. If that makes sense.
How are you labeling your clusters? Is that through automated topic modeling, or is that manual effort?
Yeah, so it's both. There's a machine learning suggestion that's trained on every single cluster we've ever labeled. So there are maps that look at topics that we're deeply familiar with, and at that stage, the machine learning is pretty good. They look at features, so most shared words, hashtags, where are the accounts located, and then the normal process is we work with subject matter experts that indeed review the features that are in common for that clusters. Most shared images, most shared media links, most shared media sources, the types of language, the types of account location, bios and descriptions of the accounts, and then they make a decision based on that. For a lot of complex campaigns, we really tend to work with subject matter experts because sometimes you also need deep contextual insights to be able to do proper labeling.
Cool, thanks.